Perpetualism Solum after the quantum turn. This series does not present a new interpretation of quantum mechanics. It does not revise the formalism, dispute experimental results, or propose alternative physical mechanisms. Quantum mechanics is taken here as complete in its predictive and mathematical function. The question addressed is ontological. Specifically, what must already be true of reality for a theory with this structure to be possible at all? For over a century, quantum mechanics has operated successfully without an agreed ontological ground. Its equations are precise, its predictions are reliable. What remains unsettled is not how the theory works, but what kind of reality could sustain such a framework without contradiction. Most interpretive approaches attempt to resolve this by adding assumptions to the theory or by redescribing its results. This series does neither. Instead, it changes the level of analysis. Perpetualism is not derived from quantum mechanics. It is an ontological framework developed independently through investigation of recursive structure across multiple domains. Quantum mechanics is introduced here as a constraint, a formal system that any adequate ontology must be able to support without modification. The task is therefore not explanation, but demonstration. We will show that the core structures of quantum mechanics correspond systematically to elements of a relational ontology, in which relation is ontologically prior to substance, observation is a structural component of manifestation, and coherence must be maintained without appeal to a final foundation. Nothing in the physics will be altered. No metaphorical translation will be used. The goal is to show that the formalism already presupposes the ontological commitments articulated by Solum. The previous release, Solum, A New Ontology, introduced the framework in isolation. This series examines its operational capacity under pressure from a theory widely regarded as ontologically problematic. If the framework fails to support quantum mechanics, it fails categorically. If it succeeds, the success is structural rather than interpretive. This is not an argument for perpetualism based on physics. It is a test of ontological adequacy using physics as a limiting case. What follows proceeds section by section. Terms will be introduced only when necessary. Claims will be made only where correspondence can be shown. The purpose is not persuasion. The purpose is coherence. Part 1. Scope, clarification, and level of inquiry. This work does not propose a new interpretation of quantum mechanics. It does not alter the mathematical formalism, contest experimental outcomes, or speculate about hidden physical mechanisms. Quantum mechanics is taken as a mature and internally successful descriptive system within its proper domain. The issue addressed here is ontological rather than physical. The central question is not how quantum mechanics functions, but what must already be the case about reality for a theory with this structure: non-substantial, observer-involving, and formally complete without ontological closure, to be possible at all. This distinction is essential. Interpretations of quantum mechanics typically operate at the same descriptive level as the theory itself. They attempt to add narrative, metaphysical commitments, or auxiliary structures in order to stabilize meaning. The present inquiry instead steps beneath that level, asking after the conditions that make any such description legitimate. Perpetualism does not emerge from quantum mechanics, nor is it tailored to resolve its paradoxes. It is an independently developed ontological framework concerned with generative relation, coherence under accumulation, and recursive stabilization without foundational closure. Quantum mechanics enters this work not as a source, but as a constraint. The method is therefore demonstrative rather than explanatory. We do not seek to explain quantum mechanics in ontological terms. We seek to demonstrate that its formal structure already presupposes the ontological commitments articulated by Solum. If those commitments are absent, the theory remains operational but conceptually ungrounded. If they are present, the theory's structure becomes legible without modification. Nothing in the physics is asked to change. What is tested is ontology. Part 2. Why quantum mechanics functions as an ontological constraint. Quantum mechanics is introduced here not because it requires philosophical clarification, but because it exerts maximal pressure on ontology. Unlike earlier physical theories, quantum mechanics remains formally complete while resisting any stable account of what its mathematical elements are descriptions of. Its success does not depend on ontological resolution. It predicts accurately without specifying a determinate substrate, a localized ontology of objects, or an observer-independent state of affairs. This feature is not accidental. It indicates that the theory operates at a boundary where traditional ontological assumptions, substance, separability, intrinsic properties, no longer function as prerequisites for coherence. Any ontology that insists upon those assumptions must either reinterpret the theory beyond recognition or treat its results as anomalous. From the present standpoint, this resistance is diagnostic rather than problematic. Quantum mechanics functions as a constraint because it demonstrates, in practice, that a physical theory can remain empirically closed while ontologically open. Its formalism tolerates indeterminacy at the level of description because coherence is preserved at the level of relational structure. Measurement does not reveal pre-existing values. It registers outcomes produced through interaction. The theory remains consistent because it does not require that what is measured existed in determinate form prior to that interaction. An ontology adequate to this structure must therefore accommodate three features simultaneously: the primacy of relation over intrinsic property, the participation of observation in determination, and the maintenance of coherence without appeal to a final underlying substrate. Perpetualism claims that these features are not exceptional, but necessary. Quantum mechanics does not introduce them into reality. It exposes them by operating where inherited ontological assumptions fail. The theory works because it already conforms, operationally, to the conditions that Solum articulates explicitly. This is why quantum mechanics is not treated here as evidence for perpetualism, nor as a domain to be interpreted through it. It is treated as a limiting case. Any ontology that cannot sustain a theory with this structure, without supplementation, seeps into contradiction, fails by insufficiency. The task, then, is not to align perpetualism with quantum mechanics through analogy or metaphor, but to show that both are constrained by the same ontological requirements. Where the theory remains silent, ontology speaks. Where ontology overreaches, the theory resists. What follows proceeds by mapping these constraints explicitly. Part 3. Solum as the necessary condition of ontological openness. If a theory can function coherently without ontological closure, then closure cannot be a prerequisite for reality. Quantum mechanics does not merely tolerate openness, it depends on it. Its formal structure presupposes that determinacy emerges through interaction rather than being exhausted prior to it. What is not specified in advance is not unreal, it is unresolved. This distinction matters ontologically. An ontology that treats indeterminacy as absence, deficiency, or ignorance fails immediately. The theory requires that reality can remain open without collapsing into incoherence. There must therefore exist a condition in which manifestation is possible without final specification. Solum names this condition. Solum is not a foundation beneath reality, nor a substrate from which entities arise. It is the open ontological field in which relational determination can occur without requiring prior closure. It is not what things are made of, but what allows anything to appear as something at all, while remaining subject to further determination. This openness is not unlimited. If openness were unconstrained, no coherent manifestation could persist. The condition Solum designates is therefore not indeterminacy alone, but indeterminacy capable of sustaining coherence across accumulation. What persists does so not by exhausting possibility, but by remaining compatible with what has already occurred. This distinction is critical. Solum does not oppose structure. It makes structure possible without making it final. From this perspective, the absence of a determinate quantum state prior to measurement is not a metaphysical gap. It is an instance of ontological openness operating correctly. Determination occurs where interaction registers. Coherence is maintained because what emerges remains compatible with the total relational context. Solum therefore provides what quantum mechanics presupposes but does not articulate. A ground that is not grounding in the classical sense. It does not explain outcomes. It explains how outcomes can arise without contradiction in the absence of prefixed being. The ontology is minimal but non-negotiable. Without Solum, openness becomes unintelligible. With it, indeterminacy is no longer a problem to be solved but a condition to be borne. The subsequent sections will show how coherence is maintained within this openness, how accumulation introduces ontological load, and how stability arises without substance. The aim is not synthesis but sufficiency, registration, coherence, and the ontological status of gravity. The framework established thus far permits a final clarification concerning registration, gravity, and the status of physical description within perpetualism. This clarification is not additive. It functions as a boundary condition, preventing categorical error at the point where ontology and physics appear to converge. Registration as ontological status. Registration must not be construed as an event, operation, or process. It is not something that happens to configurations, nor is it a mechanism through which configurations are admitted into reality. Registration names a binary ontological condition. A configuration either satisfies the constraint of coherence or it does not. There is no intermediate state. To say that a configuration is registered is to say nothing more and nothing less than that it achieves sufficient compatibility with the totality of accumulated relation to persist as part of that totality. Registration is therefore not subsequent to manifestation. It is identical with manifestation under coherence constraint. What fails to register does not persist, does not appear, and does not enter into relation. It is not excluded, it is structurally impossible. This framing removes all residual temporal and causal connotations. Registration does not occur in time, because time presupposes stabilized succession. Registration does not occur in space, because space presupposes stabilized differentiation. Registration is not evaluated, selected, or enforced. It is the ontological condition under which generative relation achieves persistence rather than dissolution. The asymmetry is absolute. Coherence is required for manifestation, but manifestation does not produce coherence. Coherence is not satisfied by degrees, nor relaxed under circumstance. Either compatibility with accumulated relation is achieved or no configuration results. Coherence as non-descriptive constraint. It follows that coherence cannot be assimilated into any descriptive category without distortion. It is not a force, because forces presuppose differentiated entities capable of interaction. It is not a field, because fields presuppose a domain of distribution. It is not geometry, because geometry presupposes measurable extension. Each of these belongs to regimes that arise only after registration has already succeeded. Coherence does not govern reality. It does not regulate outcomes. It does not act upon configurations. It names the structural necessity that generative relationality must satisfy to avoid incoherence. Its operation is entirely negative in form. Incoherence does not persist. Stability is not imposed. Instability fails to register. This distinction is critical. To mistake coheres for a governing principle is to reintroduce an external order that the ontology has already excluded. Coheres is internal to generative relation as its condition of possibility, not an addition to it. Gravity as descriptive legibility. Within this framework, gravity must be located with precision. Gravity is not coheres. Gravity is not caused by coheres. Gravity is not a mechanism by which coherence is maintained. Gravity is the manner in which successful registration under accumulated ontological load becomes legible within spatiotemporal descriptive regimes. Once relational configurations have stabilized sufficiently to support spatial differentiation and temporal ordering, the requirement that each configuration remain compatible with the total accumulated structure appears within those regimes as gravitational phenomena. Mass, curvature, attraction, and temporal dilation are not ontological primitives. They are the descriptive forms through which coherence constraint becomes measurable after localization and temporality are already in place. This explains both gravity's universality and its resistance to reduction. Gravity applies to all configurations because all configurations must satisfy coheres. Yet gravity cannot be unified straightforwardly with other forces because it is not a force at all. It is the metric registration of ontological load within frameworks that presuppose space and time. The equivalence principle does not undermine this account. The local eliminability of gravitational effects reflects the fact that gravity is not fundamental but descriptive. Coheres remains invariant under coordinate transformation because it is not a coordinate-dependent feature. What can be transformed away is not the constraint but its representational form. Locality revisited. This location of gravity clarifies the earlier derivation of locality. Locality is not a condition required for coherence. It is an outcome of successful coherence. When registration stabilizes differentiation, configurations become locally distinct. Once locality is achieved, coherence constraint registers locally. Gravity appears local not because the constraint is local, but because locality is how constraint becomes legible once differentiation has stabilized. Quantum non-locality is therefore not anomalous. It reflects configurations that have not yet fully resolved into localized registration. Where locality weakens, gravitational description loses clarity, not because coherence fails, but because the descriptive regime no longer applies cleanly. Final boundary. This ontology does not explain gravity in the sense physics seeks explanation. It explains why gravity is inevitable wherever coherent manifestation persists under accumulation. It does not replace physical theory, supplement it, or correct it. It situates it. Physics describes what is already registered. Ontology articulates the conditions under which registration is possible. The distinction must be preserved. When it collapses, coherence is mistaken for causation, necessity for mechanism, and description for ground. Perpetualism resists this collapse by design. Coherence remains what it must be, the non-negotiable constraint without which generative relation cannot persist. Gravity remains what it is, a descriptive consequence of that persistence once space and time have become legible. Nothing more is claimed, nothing less is sufficient. Accumulation, ontological load, and the absence of erasure. If openness alone were sufficient for manifestation, reality would never stabilize. If coherence alone were sufficient, reality would never generate. What sustains persistence across manifestation is neither closure nor stasis, but accumulation under constraint. This introduces the next unavoidable feature of any adequate ontology: ontological load. Generative relation does not reset. There is no ontological blank slate between configurations. Every successful registration modifies the conditions under which subsequent registration must occur. What is cohered remains present. not as an object preserved in time, but as a constraint inherited by further manifestation. This is what perpetualism designates accumulation. Accumulation does not mean storage. Reality does not warehouse past configurations as retained entities. What accumulates is compatibility itself, the total pattern of relations that have successfully registered and therefore cannot be contradicted by what follows. Accumulation is not additive in content, but cumulative in constraint density. Each new configuration must bear what has already cohered. This bearing is ontological load. Ontological load is not weight, pressure, or resistance in a physical sense. Those are descriptive translations that arise only after spatial and temporal regimes are in place. Ontological load names a structural demand. Any new manifestation must remain compatible with the entire accumulated field of prior coherence. Nothing can appear that would invalidate what has already appeared. This demand is not enforced, it is not applied, it is simply inescapable. A configuration that would contradict accumulated coherence does not fail after appearing. It never registers at all. The absence of erasure is not a process, it is a condition. This clarifies a point that often invites misunderstanding. Accumulation does not imply temporal sequencing. It does not require a before and after. It requires only that compatibility be non-negotiable. What is cohered cannot be undone, not because time forbids it, but because incoherence cannot persist. The asymmetry is structural, not temporal. From this, several consequences follow immediately. First, persistence does not require identity. What endures is not a thing maintaining itself through change, but coherence being continuously satisfied across generative differentiation. Stability is achieved not by sameness, but by compatibility. What appears stable within descriptive regimes is the surface expression of this deeper requirement. Second, complexity is not optional. As accumulation increases, the constraint density of the field increases. New configurations must negotiate an increasingly structured inheritance. This does not limit manifestation, it refines it. The field becomes capable of supporting more differentiated, more articulated forms, precisely because incoherence has been excluded without closure. Third, no configuration is self-sufficient. Ontological load is total. There are no isolated manifestations that carry only their own conditions. Every registration bears the entirety of accumulated coherence implicitly, whether or not this is descriptively visible. What later appears as interaction, influence, or dependency is the legible shadow of this fact. This is why perpetualism cannot admit erasure at the ontological level. Erasure would require that a configuration both register and later be rendered incompatible with what follows. That would violate coherence. What disappears descriptively does so only because the descriptive regime no longer tracks it, not because it has been ontologically undone. The past, in this sense, is not a location, it is accumulated constraint. The future is not a destination, it is openness conditioned by what cannot be contradicted. These are not temporal claims, they are consequences of accumulation without erasure. Ontological load, therefore, performs a crucial function. It explains how reality can remain open without becoming arbitrary, and how it can remain coherent without becoming fixed. It also prepares the ground for understanding why irreversibility must appear once descriptive regimes emerge, without invoking time as a primitive. What has accumulated cannot be unborn. This is not because reality moves forward, but because coherence cannot be reversed. The next section will formalize how this accumulated load becomes ordered once differentiation stabilizes sufficiently for descriptive regimes to arise, without reintroducing foundation, flow, or ontological time. Ordering without time, irreversibility as constraint, not flow. At this stage of the framework, a pressure becomes unavoidable. We have established generative relation without substance, Solum, coherence under accumulation, without governance, coheres, and registration as the binary condition of manifestation. Accumulated relation does not erase. It persists as constraint. Ontological load increases. Stability is achieved only through compatibility with what has already registered. What has not yet been introduced is time, and yet ordering is already unavoidable. This is the critical point at which many ontologies fail. Having rejected time as primitive, they nonetheless smuggle it back in through succession, causation, or process language. Perpetualism cannot permit this. If ordering is to appear, it must do so as a structural consequence of accumulation itself, not as a background dimension, not as flow, and not as a hidden parameter. The task of this section is therefore precise: to show how ordering and irreversibility emerge necessarily from accumulated registration without presupposing time. Accumulation as a symmetry. Accumulation introduces a non-negotiable asymmetry into generative relation. Each registered configuration becomes part of the total relational field. It does not persist as an object, memory, or record, but as constraint. Once registered, it cannot be undone. Not because reversal's forbidden, but because reversal would require incoherence with the accumulated structure that now includes it. This is not temporal irreversibility, it is ontological asymmetry. The asymmetry is simple and absolute. What has registered constrains what can register. What has not registered constrains nothing. This asymmetry does not require a before and after in time. It requires only non-erasure. The field of relation becomes progressively more constrained, not sequentially, but structurally. The space of possible compatibility narrows as load accumulates. Ordering arises here as necessity, not as sequence. Why order does not require time. Ordering is often mistaken for temporal succession because, within descriptive regimes, order is tracked by clocks. But clocks do not generate order, they index it after the fact. The ontological source of order lies elsewhere. In perpetualism, order is the differential accessibility of compatibility. A configuration that must satisfy more constraints is not later in time. It is later in load. Its conditions of manifestation are stricter because the relational field it must cohere with is denser. Thus, early configurations are minimally constrained. Later configurations are maximally constrained. Early and later, here, are not temporal terms. They mark relative positions within a constraint gradient. The gradient exists even if time has not yet emerged as a legible dimension. Order is therefore not succession. Order is constraint density. Irreversibility without flow. Once accumulation is understood as non-erasing constraint, irreversibility follows immediately. Irreversibility does not mean that configurations cannot change. It means that the relational field cannot return to a state of lower constraint without incoherence. The total field cannot forget what is registered, because forgetting would require violating compatibility with itself. This is why irreversibility is structural rather than dynamical. No process runs forward, no arrow pushes reality along. There is simply no path back to a less constrained condition without collapse. What we call the past is not a location. It is accumulated constraint. What we call the future is not a destination. It is the open region of compatibility that remains unsaturated. Flow is a later description. Irreversibility is already present. Temporis as residual ordering. At this point, temporis can be situated with precision. Temporis is not an additional ontological layer. It is the residual structure that appears once ordering becomes legible within stabilized configurations capable of internal differentiation. When relational configurations achieve sufficient coherence to support persistence, differentiation, internal comparison, then the constraint gradient becomes expressible as sequence. Ordering becomes measurable. Duration becomes articulable. Time appears. But this appearance is downstream. Temporis does not generate irreversibility. Irreversibility generates the conditions under which temporis becomes legible. Time is therefore not the source of order. It is the metric residue of order once registration has stabilized sufficiently to permit internal reference. The moment revisited. This allows a final clarification that aligns solum, coheres, and temporis without collapse. The moment is not an instant in time. The moment is the site of registration. Each moment is structurally identical. Generative openness, solum. Coherence constraint, coheres. Accumulated load, registration. What differs is not the moment itself, but the constraint context within which it occurs. That context is shaped by everything that has already registered. Moments do not pass. Configurations resolve. Time tracks this resolution only after the fact. Why this matters for physics. This section closes a crucial gap. Physics encounters irreversibility everywhere. Entropy increase, causal asymmetry, measurement collapse, cosmological expansion. But physics typically treats irreversibility as a dynamical problem. Why does time have an arrow? Why do equations permit reversal while reality does not? Perpetualism reframes the issue. The arrow does not belong to time. Time borrows the arrow from accumulation. Irreversibility is ontologically prior to temporality. Time inherits direction because reality cannot erase its own registrations. This is why attempts to explain irreversibility within time repeatedly fail. The explanation runs the wrong way. Boundary discipline preserved. Nothing in this section introduces mechanism, causation, or physical law. No claim is made about entropy, thermodynamics, or cosmology as theories. Those remain descriptive domains. What has been articulated is the condition under which any irreversible description can apply at all. Ordering is not imposed, flow is not assumed, time is not smuggled. What emerges instead is necessity. Accumulation without erasure cannot avoid asymmetry. Asymmetry cannot avoid ordering. Ordering does not require time. Temporis arrives only when ordering becomes legible. Part 7. Determination without collapse. At this point, the remaining pressure point must be addressed directly. Determination. Quantum mechanics forces determination to occur without permitting it to be grounded in pre-existing states. Outcomes appear, yet nothing in the formalism licenses the claim that those outcomes were already the case prior to interaction. This is the source of the familiar language of collapse, a term that names the appearance of definiteness, while quietly importing a metaphysics of prior completion. From the standpoint established by Solum, collapse is neither required nor intelligible. Determination does not occur by the elimination of unrealized possibilities. It occurs by registration under constraint. Within an open ontology, multiple incompatible configurations may remain structurally admissible until interaction forces a resolution that must satisfy coheres. What resolves is not selected from a completed inventory of hidden states. It is generated as the only configuration that can persist compatibly with the accumulated relational field at that point of interaction. Determination, then, is not subtraction. It is compatibility, achievement. This reframes the status of the quantum state with precision. The state vector is not a description of what is, nor is it a representation of ignorance about what already exists. It is a formal encoding of relational admissibility, of what may register without incoherence given the present structure of accumulated relation. When interaction occurs, that admissibility is forced through a constraint boundary. What emerges is not revelation but resolution. Nothing collapses. What fails to register does not disappear. It never achieves ontological status in the first place. This distinction dissolves the need for supplementary metaphysics. There is no branching into parallel worlds, because no unresolved configuration persists as a realized alternative. There is no hidden variable substrate, because nothing requires completion prior to registration. There is no observer-induced causation, because registration is not enacted by observation, but by coherence constraint. Observation participates, but it does not decide. Measurement is not an act that changes reality. It is a situation in which reality is required to resolve. The irreversibility of measurement follows immediately. Once a configuration has registered, once it has achieved compatibility with the total accumulated field, it cannot be undone without violating coherence. The appearance of a definite outcome is therefore not contingent on consciousness, macroscopic amplification, or decoherence narratives. It is a structural consequence of constraint satisfaction under accumulation. This also explains why probabilities behave as they do. Probability in quantum mechanics is not a measure of ignorance about an underlying actuality. It is a measure of structural openness, of how many admissible configurations remain compatible prior to registration. The Born rule does not assign likelihoods to hidden states. It weights the space of possible registrations relative to the relational structure already in place. Once registration occurs, probability vanishes, not because uncertainty has been resolved epistemically, but because openness has been closed locally through determination. The system does not choose an outcome, it achieves one. Locality reappears here in its correct role. Determination is always local, not because coherence constraint is local, but because locality is the form. Coherence takes once differentiation has stabilized. Where localization is incomplete, determination appears non-local. Where localization is sharp, outcomes appear definite and classical. The difference is not ontological, but registrational. Thus, the so-called measurement problem reduces to a category error. There is no problem of how potential becomes actual. There is only the fact that actuality is the name we give to what has registered. Quantum mechanics does not fail to explain collapse. It refuses collapse because collapse is not the correct ontological description of what occurs. The theory functions because it already operates as if determination were registrational rather than eliminative. Solum makes this explicit. Determination is not a metaphysical event layered atop the formalism. It is the structural consequence of openness encountering constraint. Once that encounter occurs, coherence demands resolution. What resolves persists. What does not never was. Nothing more is required. Nothing less is sufficient. Integration without unification. With determination properly situated, the final temptation must be resisted, unification. The pressure to unify, to reduce openness, constraint, determination, locality, probability, and gravity into a single ontic mechanism is not a scientific necessity, it is a metaphysical habit inherited from ontologies that require closure in order to remain intelligible. Solum does not share that requirement. What has been demonstrated across the preceding sections is not that quantum mechanics needs an ontology to function, but that ontology must satisfy certain conditions if quantum mechanics is to be possible without contradiction. Those conditions do not converge on a single substance, process, or law. They converge on coordination. Solum coordinates without collapsing. Openness is preserved without indeterminacy becoming incoherence. Constraint operates without governance or force. Determination occurs without collapse. Locality emerges without being fundamental. Gravity registers without being ontological ground. Time orders without being primitive. Each of these achieves legitimacy only by not absorbing the others. This is the sense in which perpetualism is deliberately non-unificatory. It does not seek a final object that explains everything. It articulates a minimal grammar that prevents explanation from exceeding its domain. The desire for a single underlying entity, field, information, string, wave function of the universe, reappears here as a category error. What is fundamental is not a thing, but a set of constraints that must be jointly satisfied for manifestation to occur at all. Quantum mechanics does not point toward a deeper object. It points toward the insufficiency of objecthood. The theory remains open because reality remains open. Its formal completeness without ontological closure is not a defect, but a signal. Where physics stops, ontology does not replace it. Ontology explains why stopping is required. This is why the correspondence established throughout the series is not interpretive. No metaphor has been imposed on the formalism. No physical term has been redescribed to serve philosophical ends. Instead, the ontological commitments that quantum mechanics already presupposes, relation, openness, participation, coherence without substrate, have been made explicit and shown to be necessary. Nothing in the theory is altered. What changes is its legibility. Quantum mechanics no longer appears ontologically anomalous. It appears ontologically disciplined. It functions precisely because it refuses to overcommit. Because it allows determination without preexistence, probability without ignorance, and measurement without metaphysical excess. Solum does not explain quantum mechanics. It explains why quantum mechanics does not need explanation in the traditional sense. The framework stands or falls on sufficiency alone. If it can support a theory that operates coherently without closure, then it has met its burden. If it could not, no amount of rhetorical elegance would rescue it. At this point, the test has been applied. The ontology has not collapsed. The physics has not been distorted. No supplementary metaphysics has been smuggled in. What remains is not a conclusion, but a boundary. Physics describes what registers. Ontology articulates the conditions of registration. Where that distinction is preserved, coherence endures. And where coherence endures, no further ground is required. Closure without finality. What remains is to clarify what kind of closure this work can legitimately claim. Solum does not conclude by resolving quantum mechanics, nor by extracting metaphysical comfort from its strangeness. It concludes by establishing a boundary condition for ontological adequacy. That boundary has now been crossed and tested. The result is not a synthesis, it is a limit. An ontology sufficient to sustain quantum mechanics must allow the following without contradiction: determination without pre-existent values, coherence without foundational substance, openness without collapse into incoherence, participation without subjectivism, descriptive completeness without ontological closure. Solum satisfies these requirements not by explaining them away, but by refusing to mislocate them. Indeterminacy is not treated as ignorance. Observation is not treated as intrusion. Probability is not treated as epistemic weakness. Locality is not treated as primitive. Gravity is not treated as cause. Each is situated where it belongs, as a descriptive articulation of registered coherence under constraint. This is the sense in which Solum is complete enough. Not complete in content, but complete in restraint. No additional ontological layers are required. No hidden variables are demanded. No collapse mechanism is smuggled in. No privileged observer is installed. No global state is reified beyond what the formalism can support. The ontology does not close reality. It closes a category error. That error consists in demanding that reality be fully specified in advance in order to be real. Quantum mechanics has already shown that this demand is unnecessary. Solum shows that it is incoherent. What exists need not be exhausted. What manifests need not be final. What coheres need not be grounded beneath itself. Persistence is achieved not through foundation, but through compatibility. This applies not only to physics, but to any domain that traffics in structure, explanation, or normativity. Once coherence is understood as the primary constraint, authority shifts. Explanation becomes local. Finality becomes illegitimate. Responsibility replaces certainty. This is not an ethical conclusion, but it has ethical consequences. It is not an epistemology, but it constrains epistemic posture. It is not a metaphysics of comfort. It is a metaphysics of sufficiency. Solum does not tell us what the world is made of. It tells us what the world must not require in order to endure. That is the only closure an open ontology can justify. No further claims are necessary. No stronger claims are permitted. The framework ends where it must. Not with an answer, but with a condition that has been met. The ground is open.